Hi, this is the Detangler, and today we're going to talk about Samson, as in and Delilah fame. I thought that this was just going to be a simple story about castration anxiety. Man gets betrayed by woman who cuts off his source of power, in this case hair, because as you know, I am totally into hair. This is the Detangler, where I talk about all of these stories, these myths, these fantasies that we have about hair. And one thing I really dig about hair is how we can remove it from our body. It's both human and not quite human. It's a fiber that we create ourselves. And today we're going to talk about Samson. Now, I am not a religious scholar. I am not religious. I'm a hair theorist. But Samson is a Bible story, and a lot of people take the Bible and religion very seriously. I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I don't want to piss anybody off. Let's all just agree that religion is complicated, and this happens to be an extra complicated story. So Samson turns up in the book of Judges in the Bible, which is after the first 5 books, the Torah. Joshua leads the 12 tribes of Israel out of Egypt, and they get settled in Canaan. But then he dies, leaving them without a leader. And since people are kind of naturally greedy and corrupt, they fall into bad to worse, and the book of Judges is meant to chronicle all of that. They keep quoting over and over, they had no king at that time, and every man had to decide for himself what was right or wrong, something like that. And Samson is the final and worst example of the bad leaders that they have. Now, some people think that the Bible is pure fact. You can believe every single thing in it, while others think that it is total fiction, complete mythology. After reading this section, I think it's more like historical fiction, because at least in this part, there is archaeological evidence as to who was living in these areas that are mentioned in this story. We know that the Philistines and the Israelites were actually inhabiting these areas. And some of the things are just way too fantastic to swallow. So I think that Samson is a fictional character set in a historical context. Let's talk about historical context. This is happening roughly 1100-ish BCE, before the Common Era. So that's the Iron Age. Big civilizations are happening. Ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. There's a lot going on. And this is taking place in what is now modern-day Israel and Palestine. And just as it is today, there was a lot of conflict. In this story, Samson's main enemy are the Philistines. And if Philistine sounds similar to Palestine, it's because they come from the same root word. But the Palestinians do not think that the Philistines were their ancestors. The Philistines came from Greece, most likely. The Mediterranean was experiencing a bunch of problems, drought, attacks, 150 years of unrest. It kind of brought about the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. A bunch of people were forced to migrate, and so the Philistines most likely came from ancient Greece and ended up in what is now modern-day Palestine. They were probably sea people. Now, Samson came from the Dan tribe, which just cracks me up every time because, like, Dan, what an undignified name. It's like, dude, might as well be the dude tribe. Anyway, 12 tribes of Israel, one of them is named Dan. Samson lived in this little corner here, which is, kind of right on the border between the Dan tribe, the Judah tribe, and Philistia. It's not like these borders were, carefully drawn. People came and went freely. It was a mixed neighborhood. Throughout the book of Judges, God is pissed off at the people of Israel because they've been worshiping other gods and just generally not being very good Jews. And so he's punishing them by having the Philistines dominate them. But the domination is going fine. I mean, everybody seems to be getting along pretty well. And actually, that's what pisses off God even more, because he can't have his chosen people just assimilate. And so he uses Samson, with all of his faults, to basically pick fights with the Philistines. Anyway, it wasn't just the people of Israel and the Philistines. The people of Israel were actually made up of these 12 different tribes, and there was always all sorts of infighting going on. They weren't like one people, just as today, in any given religion, you're not going to have everyone think alike. And it wasn't just the Jews and the Philistines. There were other groups vying for top dog too. There were the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Ammonites, the Midianites. The Middle East has a long history of conflict. So everyone's kind of fighting with each other on and off. And God is just like pulling all the strings because God in the Old Testament is really sort of vindictive. And, the Jews are his chosen people. And so he ultimately wants them to win, but he also wants to teach them a lot of lessons. This story is really tough because violence begets violence. There's just revenge, never ending cycles of getting back at each other. And the heroes are the heroes because they kill more of the enemies, and the enemies are the enemies because God says so. And this is all within the context of the entire biblical narrative, which I freely admit I do not fully understand. But this basically brings us to Samson, who is our very flawed hero. Samson's mother is barren, and then an angel comes to her and says, "You're going to have a child who's going to save the Jews from the Philistines." Now, whenever there's a woman who can't have a child and an angel comes to her and announces something, pay attention. We had Sarah, who had Isaac. She was too old and barren. We had, later on in the New Testament, Elizabeth with John the Baptist, also old and barren. And then, obviously, we had the Virgin Mary, who is a virgin. All of these people have these miraculous children. Of course, unlike Sarah or Elizabeth or Mary, Samson's mother doesn't have a name. Still, it's going to be important because there's an annunciation here. So Samson's mother has to make a deal with God that Samson will be a Nazirite. A Nazirite, not to be confused with Nazarene, that's what Jesus is because he comes from a place called Nazareth. But Samson is a Nazirite, which comes from the word Nazir, which means to consecrate or separate. And so Samson from birth is consecrated or separated from other people through these special vows that he has to live by. And anyone can be a Nazirite if they just make this deal. Usually most people who choose to become a Nazirite do it for a fixed amount of time. But Samson is the first person and one of the few people who's a Nazirite from birth. So the deal is you're not allowed to drink alcohol or anything made from grapes. You're not allowed to touch dead bodies, and you're not allowed to cut your hair. The purpose of these restrictions was that you have this special relationship with God. God's going to keep a close eye on you. You know who else are Nazirites? Rastafarians. That's why they don't cut their locks. Someday I'll do another episode on locks or dreadlocks. I prefer to call them locks because they're not dreadful. Rastafarians have taken a similar Nazirite oath. Anyway, some people think that Samson's hair was actually in locks because when the deed happens later on, when Delilah arranges for his hair to be cut, they refer to it as the 7 locks on his head. But then other people think that those 7 locks refer to the sun's rays because Samson was a sun god. Samson actually means the son of the sun, sun. Anyway, Samson is a Nazirite and he's taken these vows to be closer to God. But as we will soon find out, Samson is really not very good at following rules. So it's interesting that it's the hair rule that gets him in the end. Samson is set up to be a great hero at a time when the Jews are not behaving well, and Samson is definitely not behaving well. After his origin myth, the next time we see Samson, he's a young man, and he's walking from his place to a nearby town called Timnah, where he sees this young Philistine woman and he wants to marry her. And so he goes back to his parents and quite rudely is like, "Get her for me." And they're like, "Can't you find a nice Jewish girl?" But he wants her, and so they set about arranging the marriage. One day, he's commuting between his parents' house and this woman's house, and he comes upon a lion. He kills it with his bare hands, and that is his first evidence of this great strength that God has given him. Artists love depicting this scene. And if it looks kind of similar to you as maybe what you've seen with Hercules or maybe Gilgamesh, that's because they're all basically the same story. There's actually a seal from the 12th century BCE, which is around the same time that this Samson story is supposed to be taking place, showing a man and a lion. And we don't really know if this is meant to be depicting Samson or Hercules or Gilgamesh, or if it's just the origin myth that all of them come from. The next time Samson's on this commute, he sees the body of the lion there with a bunch of bees buzzing around it. And so he reaches into the body of the lion and scoops out a bunch of honey, eats it straight away, brings some home to his parents. But the lion's dead, right? And he's not supposed to be touching any corpses. So he never tells his parents about it. It's unclear whether the Nazirite vow includes animals as part of the corpse's restriction, or is it just human bodies? But because he's too ashamed to tell his parents where he got the honey, I think that this is the first time he's breaking his Nazirite vow. And the next time we see Samson, he's at his wedding feast, which definitely wine was served there, and scholars agree that it's implied he was drinking some of his wine. So that's his second Nazirite vow. You can see in this Rembrandt painting how his wife is just like, oh, what have I gotten myself into? Meanwhile, Samson is posing this really stupid riddle to the wedding party. It's not even a riddle. It's a trick question. It's about the lion and the honey, and they have no way of knowing the answer at all. And so his new wife just pesters him for the answer, and he tells her because this is foreshadowing for what happens with Delilah later on. And so then when they get the answer to his riddle right, he's like, well, you only know because my heifer told you. Heifer? Nice way to treat your new wife, huh, Samson? The winner of this riddle was supposed to get 30 new suits. And so Samson goes to some other Philistine town, kills 30 guys, takes their suits, and brings it back to the wedding party. And he's like, here, you won, take your suits. Also, if the vow wasn't broken with the lion, it certainly is now with all those dead people. And things only get worse. So some time passes, and Samson decides that he wants some husband-wife time. So he goes back to Timnah, and when he shows up there, everybody's surprised to see him. His father-in-law is like, I thought you hated her, so I've married her off to somebody else. But here, have her younger sister. She's really pretty. And Samson is just pissed off. That does not do it for him. So what he does is he rounds up 300 foxes, ties them together tail to tail, and attaches a torch to them, and then goes and sends them off into the crops so they burn everything down. What the actual psychosis, right? I mean, I guess I've got to give him points for creativity, but this is just disturbing. So the Philistines are understandably pissed off that he's ruined their whole livelihood, all of their crops, their wheat, their grapes, whatever it is that they've been growing. And in retribution, they murder his wife and her father. They burn down their house. You would think Samson would be appeased by that, but no, he's still seeking revenge. He's like, I'll get you, my pretty, and he goes off and hides in a cave. So Samson's in this cave, and then the tribe of Judah capture him and hand him over to the Philistines. This is what I was saying before about how even though they're all Israelites, they're all Jewish, they don't all think alike. All of these different tribes are not necessarily getting along great. So the tribe of Judah, they're saying, what were you thinking? The Philistines rule over us. And so they tie up Samson with these really strong ropes and hand him off. But of course, Samson, being super strong, busts out of them and grabs what is the most handy tool he can find, that happens to be a dead donkey, grabs its jawbone, and proceeds to kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. This is the violent psychopath who's supposed to be some sort of major biblical hero and like a precursor to Jesus. He's resourceful. I mean, a jawbone of an ass isn't something that I necessarily would have thought of as a murder weapon. Afterwards, Samson is all whiny, like, I'm thirsty. And so God creates a spring for him. More time passes, and Samson's feeling thirsty again. But this time for Philistine women, because we know he likes the Philistine women. So he goes to Gaza, which is, just as it is today, the biggest city around, and it's rather far from his home. So he's being pretty reckless to show his face there. And he sleeps with a harlot. And the Philistines had him trapped right up against the city gates. Or did they? Because Samson, again with his God-given incredible strength, picks up the city gates and marches off 40 miles away uphill. He is still just as crazy and impulsive and irresponsible as ever. But at least I guess he didn't kill anyone this time. Finally, we get to Delilah. Unlike the heifer and the harlot before her, at least Delilah gets a name, and her name actually sounds quite a lot like the word for nighttime. So with Samson being the son of the sun, a sun god of some sorts, and she is this night goddess, we know things aren't going to end well for them. Samson loves Delilah, but Delilah doesn't necessarily love Samson. She gets approached by the Philistine leaders to find out what is the source of Samson's strength. And so, just like his first wife did, she nags him over and over, like, oh, please tell me. And he gives her a bunch of fake answers, and each time she tries it out. So he knows that if he ever gives her the real answer, she's definitely going to give it a try. So what does he do? He gives her the real answer. He explains that he's a Nazirite, and if he ever cuts his hair, he would lose his strength. And we know that he's already broken at least the first two vows, so when the Philistines cut his hair off, that's it. He has broken his relationship with God. They're able to overpower him, capture him, make him a slave. They gouge out his eyes. While he's in prison, he thinks about his life choices. His hair has time to grow back, and he's rekindled his relationship with God. So then the Philistines are having a big celebration for their god Dagon, and they bring out Samson to entertain them, like, dance, monkey. And he does for a while, but then he's like, oh, I'm so tired. Can I just lean up against these pillars over here? And when he does that, he prays to God, for the first time really showing faith and saying, like, God, please, just this one more time. And he pushes on the pillars, and the whole temple collapses, killing 3,000 Philistines and himself, like a suicide bomber. And that's the story of Samson. People consider him a great hero. He is one of the most messed up figures in the Bible, and yet there are so many parallels between his story and Jesus's. It wasn't actually his hair that gave him the strength. It was a symbol of his deal with God. God loved Samson despite, or maybe because of, all of his faults. His poor judgment, his lying, his arrogance, his promiscuity, his violence, his vindictive nature. God used him as a tool to kill Philistines. Maybe that's why Samson's such a popular hero, because he makes horrible people feel like they can still be in God's good graces. Hair is a really powerful symbol because it's both of the body and not of the body. As far as commitments go, it's a pretty easy one to keep. You just literally don't have to do anything. Just don't cut your hair. But it's a visual indicator of how long you've actually kept that commitment. And that's why it's such a key element in this weird, complicated, disturbing story. So what do you think? Was there enough hair in this story of Samson for you? Please let me know your thoughts, your comments, your questions. See you next time on The Detangler.